Homelander begins where most products end, with a market already waiting. Vought's core business problem was straightforward. Superhuman power is wildly variable and socially dangerous, yet also incredibly valuable. To profit, you must turn a volatile miracle into a predictable service. That is what Compound V promised. It turned talent into a pipeline. In practice, this meant shifting risk from chance births to controlled laboratories. The implication was enormous. If the company could forecast power, it could price it, schedule it, and sell it. But power alone is not a product. It needs meaning. For that, Vought leaned on the same insight that drove consumer giants. Brands, not products. The strongest feat of branding is not a logo. It is a lifestyle you can step into. That detail reveals why Homelander's story was written before his character was formed. He entered the world as John, a name with no marketable myth. The lab replaced the nursery. Cameras replaced parents. Tests stood in for bedtime stories. What mattered here was the logic. Remove variables early, family, peers, unscripted bonds, and replace them with controls that management understands. Jonah Vogelbaum, the lead mind behind the program, would later admit the error. Raised without mothers, he said, subjects grew violent, aggressive, and hateful. That confession reads like a footnote in a failed experiment. It was actually a systems note. Attachment is not a soft luxury. It is a restraint you cannot fabricate later. Childhood in the facility taught one lesson over and over. There were observers and there were consequences. Flashcards taught recognition. Restraint tests taught thresholds. Moral scripts taught the right sequence of words in front of a camera. The important point is not just what he learned, but what he did not. He learned to answer, not to ask. He learned to perform, not to trust. Homelander remembers this as Marty, a memory shaped by being watched and punished. It is a telling fragment. He does not recall a hug that grounded him. He recalls surveillance that shamed him. This helps explain why approval, especially public approval, became safer than honesty. Applause has no awkward questions. Naming finished the productization. John became Homelander, a brand that fused personhood with flag and flight. The cape and colors were not fashion. They were a set packaging, an easy bridge from the lab to the lifestyle aisle. In other words, the brand narrowed the acceptable range of behavior by defining a standard pose. This worked because branding stacks signals. A name carries script prompts, sponsor expectations, and narrative cover. If you step into the word Homelander, you also step into pre-cleared plots for television, merchandising, defense lobby tours, and crisis response talking points. Each layer makes the whole seem stable. Vought's managers treated behavior the same way operations treat supply. They installed cameras and handlers to turn moods into dashboards. They broke empathy into teachable beats and timed them to media slots. In practice, that meant a boy learned the smile, then the salute, then the sound bite, long before he learned reciprocal care. From the outside, this can seem like cruelty for its own sake. Inside a corporation, it reads as risk control. Remove variance. Replace it with protocol. The immediate result is obedience in rooms, not loyalty in crises. That detail would shape the next decision. Once the brand launched, synergy took over. Homelander's rescues were content. His content drove ticket sales, streaming minutes, and defense contracts. The business insight is familiar. If meaning is the product, saturate culture with the meaning. Make the public rehearse it through shows, toys, and parades until it feels inevitable. But synergy creates a hidden dependency. The more a company ties its identity to a single star, the less freedom it has to discipline that star. In numbers, that is key man risk. In human terms, it is the day you realize the face of the company cannot be fired without taking the company with him. To solve that, Vought doubled down on interpersonal management. They tried to simulate the missing bond through a handler who blended care with command. The dynamic looked maternal from a distance and managerial up close. That's My Good Little Boy was not romance. It was a control script masquerading as affection. This helps explain why that approach worked briefly and failed decisively. Conditional warmth can cue short-term compliance. It cannot survive the moment the subject understands the condition. When love is a lever, pulling it too often reveals the pulley. After that, you no longer hold devotion. You hold a grudge. Meanwhile, the metrics encouraged the wrong lessons. Public approval rose. Crisis PR worked. The dashboard said the system was healthy. But applause is an optimization target, not a moral restraint. Teach a child that love equals ratings, and he will learn to produce ratings more reliably than truth. The institutional stakes grew as Vought sought military integration for soups. They wanted federal budgets, procurement cycles, and the authority glow that comes from uniforms. Homelander, wrapped in a flag, looked like the perfect bridge. The system believed its own story. That confidence hid the fragility underneath. Inside the training floors, restraint tests focused on thresholds and compliance, not conscience. Homelander learned exactly how hard to squeeze a lever, how fast to move a target, and how to stay on script when the camera's red light blinked. The important point is that precision without principle invites drift. When boundaries are external, they are also movable. Early public moments reinforced the feedback. Fans clapped. Executives celebrated. Handlers reported success. That detail tells us something important about institutional blindness. If a control loop measures only performance, it will reward any behavior that maintains the performance, even if it erodes the foundation the performance rests on. The crowd became the leash. That phrasing is not metaphorical. Vought routed behavioral governance through the audience. They trained Homelander to equate the people's roar with safety and self. It felt stable because ratings move in curves, not shocks. But a curve can lull you farther from the guardrail. But now the contradiction was fully built. The strongest soup drew identity from a public he could dominate, and a company that needed his face more than his cooperation. He was a product and a partner, an employee and an irreplaceable asset. The principal agent problem had a cape. We can see the downstream consequences in smaller decisions. Publicly, Vought framed missteps as PR puzzles to be solved with statements and edits. Privately, they logged them as isolated incidents to be patched by loyalty gestures. The system confused narrative repair with behavioral change. This is how applause replaces oversight. Vogelbaum's regret lands here with force. He admitted that removing the mother was a mistake, because it cut the root of prosocial regulation. You cannot patch that later with slogans and handlers. The market can price stories. It cannot mint inner life. The Marty memory returns as a motif. A child behind glass learns a simple rule. The watchers define reality. When he grows, he keeps looking for the watcher. In the stadium, he finds millions. Their noise drowns out doubt. Their cheers feel like oxygen. The leash tightens by becoming pleasurable. Naming also shows its limits. Homelander compresses national identity into a single performer. In a democracy, that is marketing. In a crisis, it is permission. The brand whispers that to protect the homeland is to do whatever the Homelander does. That inversion would haunt every later decision. At this point, the controls worked on paper. The asset delivered content. The public returned attention. The company monetized both. Still, a question hung in the air. What happens when the audience wants something the handler cannot personally give? The answer will drive the rest of this story. Before we get there, note a final layer of system logic. What centralized levers, compound fee supply, narrative production, and behavioral oversight, because centralization speeds coordination, but it also concentrates failure. When your central node is a person, not a process, that failure looks human. It is actually structural. In other words, Homelander was engineered as a product and socialized as a performance. The institution that built him taught him that love, work, and country share a scoreboard. He understood the scoreboard better than anyone. That competence made him valuable. It also made him dangerous in ways no memo could capture. We end this first step where the loop closes. A child raised without family bonds finds one bond that never fails: the crowd. A company that believes it owns the crowd routes control through that bond. The next time the asset misbehaves, the instinct will be to adjust the audience, not the upbringing. That choice will matter. In the next section, we will trace how those levers evolved as the brand grew. Handlers shifted from caretakers to courtiers. Crisis PR turned harm into storylines. And a reveal about lineage jolted the entire portfolio's risk model. For now, keep one lesson in mind. If applause is your only leash, you are training for loyalty to volume, not to values. Begin with the input, not the icon. In Vought's pipeline, Compound V is the industrial feedstock, the way powdered ore becomes steel. That framing matters because it shifts the company's mindset from heroes to batches, from family to portfolio. Standardizing power into repeatable outputs lets executives think in categories, yields, and unit economics. It explains why the process around Homelander looked like manufacturing discipline more than parenting. Compound V's value was repeatability under control. Once a serum could be stabilized, dosed, and tested, Vought could sell predictable services to cities, militaries, and media partners. The system favored Titus A's, variance reports, and control trials. A child on V becomes a product candidate, and a cohort becomes a production run. That is what batch thinking looks like in practice. Batch thinking solves one problem and creates a quieter one. It tames uncertainty, but it strips identity down to parameters. When the output is measured in destructive capacity, flight stability, and durability under stress, you get a spreadsheet that can rank any child. What you do not get is a person trained to handle ordinary friction. That omission was not an accident. It was a design decision. Homelander begins as a next-generation platform decision. Vought already had Soldier Boy, the aging flagship with war stories and political reach. But brands built on a single human body age out. If your strategy is a set longevity, you seed a replacement early and aim for higher specs. That is why Soldier Boy's DNA becomes the template. The goal is simple: surpass the original before the market notices the decline. Genetics were the first bet in a long chain of assumed control. With the right genes, you can engineer baseline power, durability, and the optics of a winning jawline. That detail reveals how branding and biology blurred inside this lab. Power came first because power sold. Loyalty was treated as a downstream variable that conditioning could handle. In other words, they bet that nurture could fix whatever nature heightened. The risk ledger should have shifted there, but it did not. Greater capability demands tighter constraints, yet Vought answered with surveillance density rather than attachment quality. Cameras, biometric locks, sedation protocols, those were the tools they trusted. What mattered here was the belief that watching hard enough equals shaping well enough. It is a belief common in factories and prisons, but thin for raising children. We know how the architects themselves understood this. The lead scientist years later admits a core design error. When I raise subjects without their mothers, they become violent, he says in remorse, naming aggression as the predictable outcome. That confession is not only personal guilt. It is a systems diagnosis. Remove attachment to eliminate risk, and you eliminate the only durable path to conscience. Vought's developmental plan traded social friction for skill acceleration. No schoolyard, no siblings, no teachers outside the program. In practice, that meant faster mastery of flight vectors and beam control, but slower growth in empathy and patience. Friction with peers teaches limits and mutuality. Without it, grandiosity expands to fill the room. That helps a spectacle brand. It hurts any future oversight that depends on shame, apology, or repair. Metrics cemented the trade. In a corporation, you manage what you can measure, and the dashboard made the values plain. Destructive capacity, rescue optics, audience sentiment, licensing velocity, those were the lines that moved careers. Internal moral formation was invisible to that screen. The important point is not that no one cared. It is that care had no metric and therefore no mandate. Facility routines followed the dashboard. Time tests rewarded split-second dominance. Stress induction used screaming sirens, surprise restraints and fear cues to provoke, then measure control. Patriotism was layered in as a stimulus package. Anthems on the loudspeakers, flag-patterned reward tokens, scripted recitations about protecting America. This worked because it built a reflex link between performance and national validation. It also trained him to treat dissent as betrayal, a brand reflex masquerading as morality. Every control was also humiliation in disguise. Constant watchers teach that privacy is deviance and feelings are punishable. You can see the lesson in the way meltdown meant sedation and debrief under cold light. What mattered here was the algorithm of care. Comfort was withheld, then traded for compliance. That system creates obedience on camera and resentment off camera. The resentment does not vanish, it compounds. Packaging was not an afterthought. It was armor, the cape that echoed a flag, the scripted patriot lines, the curated media appearances. Those design choices insulated the product from critique. Once the icon fuses with national symbols, criticism reads as unpatriotic, not as helpful feedback. That detail reveals a trap. When narrative becomes armor, the wearer learns to deflect correction by pointing to the flag. Handlers came in as incentives, not caregivers. The voices that taught him to stand taller and smile wider were compensated for clicks and ratings, not for his inner life. In practice, that signaled a stark rule. Care arrives only when the numbers move. Early proxy relationships thus trained him to see warmth as a transactional bonus for being on brand. That is not attachment, it is market conditioning. Under corporate law's gaze, the harms of this approach did not exist on paper. The cost to communities, to bystanders, and to the subject himself were externalities, off the balance sheet by design. Companies are built to record profit, not to account for grief in a pediatric ward or debris on a city block. That is how governance structures enable decisions that look rational in a spreadsheet, but corrosive in a neighborhood. The lab treated collateral damage as a line item to offset with settlements and PR. Training injuries, intimidation episodes, shattered walls. Each could be buried under non-disclosure agreements and crisis comms. This helps explain why the pipeline stayed intact. Once harms are external to reporting, no internal metric will alarm loudly enough to demand reform. The child learns a related lesson. Outcomes can be erased if the story plays well. Another routine made the point sharper. Patriotism cueing paired operant rewards to U.S. imagery. Anthem equals praise. Flag equals privilege. Spotlight equals safety. Classical conditioning underwrote the posture. Early on, that creates fast compliance inside the lab. Over time, it grows entitlement. If the flag proves I am right, then handlers are wrong when they ask for restraint. The symbol eclipses the supervisor. The surveillance grid was engineered down to hormones. Heart rate, cortisol spikes, pupil dilation. If it could be craft, it could be control. But charts do not teach reflection. They teach gaming. Under cameras, Homelander learned to look composed. Off camera, he learned that only the feed mattered. That detail helps explain his later fixation on live applause. It was the first metric that felt like love, and therefore the most reliable lever. Batch logic scaled beyond him. Across the country, infants were dosed through hospital pipelines and adoption schemes. Vought built cohorts like product lines, each with regional pilots and targeted brand strategies. The aim was portfolio diversification. Speedsters for urban delivery optics, water breathers for coastlines, heavy hitters for military contracting, Homelander's batch was the Apex run, designed to anchor the portfolio and lift every license. The Apex run amplified every flaw in the model. When you optimize for maximum capability, you concentrate failure risk. That is why aerospace spreads critical functions across redundancies. Vought did the opposite. They centralized hope and leverage in a single figure, then trusted surveillance and story to keep him inside the painted lines. This worked while he was small. It frayed the moment he could outfly the leash. A telling confession from the architect anchors the diagnosis. You should have been raised in a home with a family who loved you, he says, naming the absent variable. Inside the company, that sentence lands like a compliance audit. The missing control was attachment, the one lever you cannot fake with scripts. Love is not a measurable key performance indicator. It is a human bond that resists dashboard capture. Why I prioritize marketability over relational stability? Because brand stability pays quarterly. A perfect shot of a flag-cloaked rescue boosts licensing and comms investors. Teaching apology and repair offers no immediate return. In practice, the choice writes itself under pressure. And once Wall Street expects superhero growth, executives learn to shave every intangible that cannot be converted into a line that trends up and to the right. Corporate power also sat in a favorable climate. As regulatory muscle receded over decades, corporations learned to treat governance as a cost center to be managed. This macro backdrop matters. A company more accountable to unions, regulators, or aggressive oversight might slow the lab's excess. A company answering mainly to markets will speed the lab's pipeline and ensure the rest. Context does not excuse the design. It explains the confidence. Inside daily life, that confidence looked like a schedule. Wake to tests, train to thresholds, perform for cameras, debrief under fluorescent accuracy. Any crack in composure triggered the stress lab, then the sedation cart. The cadence produced a dependable performer and an undependable person. That contradiction would later show up at scale. Flawless optics at a press conference, then uncontrolled menace in a hallway without a lens. And consider the lab anecdote's meaning in concrete form. A child reaches for comfort, and a handler notes the camera, not the feelings. Privacy asks are logged as non-compliant. Tears extend the session. That lesson repeats until the subject equates softness with danger. The important point is not cruelty for its own sake. It is the belief that humiliation is a cost-effective control. It works quickly. It breaks slowly. Brand packaging descended early and wrapped tight. Fonts, color palettes, cape dynamics at different wind speeds, and the cadence of patriotic lines. Everything served rescue optics. The armor was so complete that critique slid off as heresy against America itself. That move inoculates a brand. It also hands the product a shield against shame. Any correction can be reframed as persecution by enemies of the flag. Handlers became courtiers by design. Access was currency, and access followed ratings. If your pep talk spiked a sentiment graph, you got another hour. If you asked for accountability that threatened a story arc, you lost your seat. That arrangement told the subject who mattered. It also told him how to act when power grew. Courtiers do not correct kings. They applaud and hope the room survives. The hidden premise took hold. A child's safety is contingent on applause. When comfort follows adoration, the audience becomes the real overseer. Later, voters and viewership replace clipboards and timers. This helps explain why public rallies felt more binding than boardroom briefings. If crowds are the leash, the company does not hold it. That quiet shift is the most consequential control failure in the entire build. Even the origin story was productized. A God-fearing farm boy who loves country, raised by normal parents. Those details were not merely lies. They were packaging solutions to anticipated concerns. They masked the lab, the cameras, and the sedation cart, and they framed the asset as a safe default. In practice, the story gave the company room to maneuver. It also gave the subject a mask to disappear behind. As for genetics, seeding Soldier Boy's line set a powerful expectation. Crossbreeding for a perfect creation promised higher ceilings and smoother brand continuity. The architect later said the quiet part aloud. Genes cannot substitute for being held. That tension is the core of this section. Biology gave Vought horsepower. Development gave Vought control. But development without love makes control brittle the second a stronger will emerges. Batch thinking also shaped how failure was handled. Outliers were contained, not counseled. Anomalies triggered stronger doses, thicker doors, and fewer visitors. In other words, the fix for human variance was industrial reinforcement. That approach is useful when the product is plastic or code. When the product is a person with exponential power, reinforcement hardens resentment into identity. What began as childproofing escalated into a theology of self. Patriot scripts told him he was chosen. Ratings told him he was adored. Handlers told him he was safe if he performed. Combine those, and you do not get humility. You get grandiosity with a performance dependency. The leash is made of clapping hands. The collar tightens only when the room goes silent. The engineering story is not just a cautionary tale. It is a diagram of incentives. Compound V supplied capability. Genetics supplied a flagship template. Surveillance promised control. Packaging manufactured virtue. And the dashboard paid for immediate optics while taxing long-term conscience as an externality to be ignored. The result was an apex asset who could not be governed by the tools that built him. The lesson inside the lab follows into the street. To see feelings as punishable will not slow down for a crying stranger. A star told that the flag justifies the act will point past the handler and toward the crowd. What mattered here was never only power level. It was the pathway by which power learned what counted. The pathway taught him that applause is truth. We will carry that pathway into the next stage, where the lab doors open and the brand meets the world, and watch which controls hold and which evaporate in daylight. The system built a hero the market could not resist and a man the company could not parent. The batch was complete. The blueprint had worked, and the seed of failure was safely embedded inside its success. The next test would not be in a lab. It would be on live television. The adult phase of control began with a person, not a policy. Madelyn Stilwell stood between Homelander and the world, with a smile that read as approval and a schedule that felt like law. She offered warmth, the way a company offers benefits, earned through performance and always contingent. That approach mattered because it mapped a human need onto corporate incentives, turning affection into a practical tool for compliance. Under Madelyn, handlers did not threaten first. They reassured first, then redirected. The sequence was deliberate because anger makes a strong man defensive, while reassurance invites him to keep earning praise. This is what I mean by maternalized management. It used intimacy as a lever, so that returning to the script felt like returning to safety. That is why meetings looked like hugs followed by notes. The affection was real enough to be legible, which is what made it useful. What mattered here was not love, but the predictability of love's distribution. If Homelander stayed on message, he received closeness. If he wandered, closeness receded with the firmness of an accounting rule. Around that relationship, Vought built a soft cage. Media training supplied answers for every forum, and talking points linked patriotic platitudes to quarterly goals. The idea was to collapse ethics into messaging, so success could be measured by applause and trending graphs. It worked because a man raised on cameras already associated approval with safety. Public relations became a logistics discipline. Press hits were scheduled like routes, and each appearance carried an approved frame that could survive hard questions by refusing the premise. This helps explain why the stories moved faster than the facts. The job was to maintain a horizon of meaning that always kept America's greatest hero ahead of proof. The system borrowed from corporate synergy. Every arm of the company, news desks, film units, consumer brands, pushed the same image across formats until dissent felt like a category error. As one critic of conglomerates observed, synergy is judged not by one product's truth, but by how well a story travels. That logic turns propaganda into workflow, which is why it feels normal when you are inside it. In practice, the talking point was the leash. Handlers fed lines calibrated to the audience and calibrated to him, designed to keep his pride and their politics moving in unison. When a camera rolled, the safest act was to repeat the brand's truth, until even skeptics sounded churlish for asking more. That detail reveals how messaging can perform the work of discipline without ever sounding like a command. But a leash made of applause only holds while applause is scarce. As Vought expanded Homelander into films, theme tie-ins, and headline cycles, they made the reward abundant and portable. He could get it with or without a handler in the room. This helps explain why the apparatus began to fail the moment he realized he could manufacture his own spotlight. Team structure was supposed to compensate. The Seven looked like a super team, but functioned like a social machine, placing peers around Homelander to normalize, to negotiate, and to stall. The theory was that strong egos moderate each other when status is shared. In reality, the team gave him rivals to dominate, scapegoats to threaten, and an audience to remind that he sat above them all. The buffer became a mirror. Every hesitation from a teammate read as disloyalty, and every apology confirmed his seniority. That dynamic worked because the company had fused heroism with celebrity, so ranking inside the Seven doubled as ranking in the national imagination. Once he believed he was the company's revenue engine, group norms were not constraints, they were props. So the apparatus turned to fear. Compliance could be purchased with secrets, so the company stored them like currency. Non-disclosure agreements, payouts, dossiers, and taped admissions. The important point is not just that blackmail was available, but that it was institutional. When leverage becomes a department, leadership stops asking who is right and asks only what will hold. Internal policing followed the same model. Isolate, humiliate, rebrand. When Starlight bucked the script, PR framed her as unprofessional and ungrateful, then wove her sincerity into a marketable arc once the wind changed. The Deep, after becoming a liability, was exiled, repackaged, and marched through contrition rituals designed to teach the room what disobedience costs. Control by humiliation instructs without memo, because everyone learns the syllabus by watching. Notice the effect on Homelander. If subordinates are tools, then dissent becomes a chance to rehearse dominance, not a cue to self-correct. This helps explain why he grew more performative under pressure. The room kept absorbing his harm as branding material, so he read that absorption as permission to escalate. Ashley became the operations face of this economy. She ran calendars like canals, moving favors, meetings, and absolution to whoever proved useful. The phrase, "Homelander appreciates your loyalty," was not flattery, it was currency. Access could be gifted to lawmakers, donors, or minor heroes as a receipt of service. That detail tells us how the company converted personal allegiance into an operating system. In politics, those receipts mattered most. Friendly senators and donors texted congratulations, jokes, and private invitations that blurred the line between institutional backing and personal endorsement. The message to Homelander was simple. Power approves you, not just your logo. That is a strong drug for anyone. But for a product raised on metrics, it sounded like proof of destiny. The apparatus handled failure with the same tools it used for launches. When civilians were harmed, PR treated the deaths as narrative obstacles, not as moral alarms. The fix was always reframing. Emphasize intent, amplify sacrifice, place a sympathetic child in the B-roll, and announce an initiative with a patriotic name. This worked because modern media rewards coherence over correction. and the company could deliver coherence on demand. Media theory has language for this. In a propaganda model, outlets do not need overt commands to align with power, because market forces and professional habits pre-align coverage. Well, the machine leaned into that structural fact. By supplying ready-made frames, flattery, and access, the company made it easier to repeat their angle than to fight it with fresh reporting. What mattered for control was the downstream lesson. If crises were repairable through narrative alignment, then consequences looked negotiable, and power looked like the ability to edit. Homelander learned that lesson. Each time the story won against the record, he discovered that facts could be managed like fans. Even the staged altruism taught a rule. Make the optics work, and the room will forgive the damage. That is not cynicism, it is observation of incentives. When legal and marketing sit at the same table, the best fix often looks like a press conference. But the control apparatus carried a flaw that scaled with success. The more the company taught him that applause was safety, the less any internal check could compete with a crowd. Rewards that once came through handlers now flowed through social channels. He could trigger himself. The leash was no longer in the office. Consider how access became tribute. Ashley could promise a meeting with a controversial ally as thanks for loyalty, and the phrase itself carried an implied bargain. Stay useful, and you get FaceTime. We even hear it in her brittle pep talks, when she says, Homelander appreciates your loyalty, like a badge that opens doors. In other words, politics became an extension of the brand's customer rewards program. Now place that against the team dynamics. The Seven existed to socialize him, but the structure rewarded his dominance displays with rating spikes and deference. Instead of softening edges, the platform amplified them, because conflict travels better than humility. That is the trap of a spectacle business. What troubles your managers can thrill your market. Handlers relied on scripts to prevent that spiral drafting responses that replaced candor with cadence. The goal was predictable sound and steady posture, because predictability calms shareholders and placates officials. But predictability also telegraphs weakness when wielded by someone who values dominance as identity. He learned to improvise on top of the script, treating the approved lines like background music for his own riff. At this point, fear strategies thickened. Dossiers grew, settlements multiplied, and every member understood that stepping out of line would be punished in public, then curated into content. It is a classic corporate cycle. Use fear to maintain order, then monetize the fallout to validate the fear. The lesson to Homelander was practical. If chaos pays, why fear it? Madelyn's presence still mattered here, because her attention could slow the acceleration. She knew when to mix praise with boundary, and she sensed when spectacle risked triggering a deeper rage. But the design tied her influence to proximity, and proximity is a fragile control when your asset can fly through walls. The important point is that a person cannot be a long-term safety mechanism for a system built to scale. After Madelyn, the apparatus lost its center and hardened into bureaucracy. Ashley inherited the levers without the authority that made them bite, so she pushed favors and punishments faster to prove function. That move revealed a core weakness. If leverage is visible, it is also negotiable, and Homelander could now bargain in public by threatening to take the ratings with him. We saw how easily meetings became transactions. Lawmakers wanted photos and momentum, brands wanted endorsements and insurance. Minor soups wanted proximity and a lifeline. By placing Homelander at the hub, Vought made every ask route through him, which raised his price inside the company. This helps explain why courtiers replaced handlers. Access became fealty, and fealty feeds the throne. Against this, some argued for stricter oversight. But oversight requires independent power and independent narrative space, both of which the synergy model erased. When every media arm repeats the frame, Outside scrutiny starts from behind, and political allies can wave it off as noise. The result is not a conspiracy, but a structure that steers around accountability. The company also leaned on curated crises to demonstrate control. A small scandal could be contained, an apology televised, and a charity event launched to close the loop. This pattern delivered a lesson to executives and to Homelander alike. Narrative cycles can substitute for discipline. In practice, that meant mistakes became raw material for the next quarter's wins. But there was a new variable waiting to rupture that cycle. Soldier Boy's reappearance and the revelation of engineered paternity rewired the brand story into lineage, legacy, and entitlement. More importantly, his blast introduced a weaponized risk to any superhero balance sheet. The possibility that powers could be stripped in an instant. Even whispers of that capacity changed how Homelander calculated threats. The apparatus had no answer ready, because every lever they held was soft: reputation, access, and staged affection. A hard check that lived outside the brand would have been a deterrent, but they had built a belief that the brand itself was the deterrent, that confusion is the heart of the failure. Applause can motivate, but it does not constrain. By the time crowds started cheering the transgressions, the leash had inverted. Vought's machine still produced scripts, but now he used them as setups for the ad-libs the audience craved. Political patrons followed the numbers. Handlers followed the patrons. In that chain, the company became the dependent, and the product became the manager of its makers. The spotlight he wielded now aimed back at the handlers. There is a point in every control system where the diagram flips. Lines of authority that once moved cleanly down from managers to assets start to bend back, drawn toward the one node the business cannot afford to lose. Well, with Homelander, that flip did not happen in a single speech or a single scandal. It happened as one lever after another failed, and the applause that once disciplined him began to validate him. The first clear severing was private, then public. When Homelander killed Madelyn Stilwell, he removed the last person who had combined emotional leverage with operational guidance. That detail reveals a quiet truth about compliance, that it is easier to steer a volatile performer through trust than through forms. After Stilwell, the paperwork remained, but the relationship was gone, so oversight became a file cabinet no one could open when it mattered. What mattered here was not only the loss of a handler, but the loss of a translation layer. Stilwell had been the human interface between superhuman capability and corporate need. In practice, she turned company strategy into praise and proximity he understood. Without that, the company reverted to scripts, performance decks, and legal memos. Those tools are precise on paper, yet fragile next to a man who can fly into the boardroom between bullet points. That is essentially what he did. Once Homelander realized he could step into executive spaces without consequence, he began treating leadership like stagehands. The power dynamic inverted. Executives tried to reduce volatility through scheduling and messaging. He reduced them by refusing to observe the frame. The important point is that star economics had finally arrived. The show's draw now outranked the show's owners, and the star knew it. Ashley's elevation completed the loop. A career publicist, she had learned control as choreography, not confrontation. Her team had always tuned stories to match market mood. Now, with the star dictating tone, they tuned themselves to his moods instead. That distinction sounds small, but it tells us why institutional capture moves quickly. When a culture is built to please audiences, it can be repurposed, almost overnight, to please one audience of one. The pairing with Stormfront lit the public end of this fuse. On paper, the brand calculus seemed obvious. Pair two high performers, cross-pollinate audiences, and capture the energy of online outrage rather than defend against it. This worked because the platform economy rewards heat as much as light. The angrier the clip, the better the spread. But a tactic turned into a worldview. Dominance stopped being a pose and started being a principle. Stormfront's appeal reframed accountability as weakness. If the other side storms the common thread, you do not apologize, you dominate the next cycle. That logic felt like empowerment from the inside. From the outside, it looked like a company inviting a strongman to write its brand values. We can learn something from real-world branding here. Firms signal progressive, innovative, or green when they need emotional bonds with stakeholders. Vought signaled order, purity, and strength, and then discovered those bonds can pull the firm rather than anchor it. Inside the Seven, the same script hardened. Briefings turned into loyalty trials, and team members became props for performance discipline. Homelander bullied a train about his body and his worth because humiliation compresses options. A shamed employee has to choose performance or penance. He belittled Starlight because doubt framed as treason lowers the cost of retaliation. This helps explain why fear is efficient and destructive at the same time. People work faster under it, but they stop telling the truth. The supersonic episode shows the mechanics. Starlight found an ally and a plan. A train, desperate to climb back into favor, relayed the information. Homelander made an example of supersonic, and then pushed the image into Starlight's hands. "This is what happens when you cross me," was the point, without needing the line. Investigations were no longer ethical duties, they were evidence of betrayal. It is the same inversion tyrants practice inside companies and countries. Checks are cast as disloyal acts. That move traveled outward to the audience. Public protests and trending campaigns were reinterpreted as rival brands. If Starlight captured a feed, he would capture the square. If a journalist asked a hard question, he would turn the moment into a dominance test. The result is subtle and dangerous. Being on camera ceased to be a risk and became a hunting ground. When he said the quiet part out loud and watched approval hold, that was a proof of concept more powerful than any memo. Here the ratings shield did its work. What's leverage had always lived in numbers. Box office, share of voice, favorability, and the broad approval that sold licensing. As long as those numbers climbed, executives believed they had consent, but applause is not consent. It is a heat map. The corporation in our world often tells itself the market will check abuse, because owners and consumers are the public. In the Homelander case, the market checked nothing. It simply rewarded escalation. The board learned too late what many analysts have noted about modern corporations. Power creates vulnerability. The bigger the brand, the more it attracts mistrust and demands for accountability. Vought had built a self-justifying spectacle that could outrun regulators, then placed a volatile actor at its center. When the crowd split between fear and adoration, the company chose the adoration because it mapped cleanly to quarterly graphs. That decision quietly removed its last internal break. Political access deepened that comfort. Messages from senators and party figures congratulated the company for standing strong. A line like "Congrats" from Lindsey Graham is not trivia. It is a signpost. It tells you a firm sees its legitimacy in alliances, not in restraints. Once a corporation believes politics is easier than governance, it stops investing in governance. It outsources safety to a smile and a handshake, and in doing so, it invites the talent to negotiate directly with power. Homelander treated the political system exactly this way. He bypassed corporate talking points and struck his own bargains, sometimes in public, often implied. When a would-be regulator or a loyalist with leverage appeared, he threatened, flattered, or replaced them. Stan Edgar's brief stand as the adult in the room faltered when allies shifted. What mattered was not who had the better argument, but who controlled the base that could flood a hearing, a hashtag, or a rally. Meanwhile, PR became a service desk for the boss's appetite. The Blue Hawk storyline is telling. Rather than pursue accountability through real community repair after violence, Ashley's team offered a filmed apology to manage a demographic problem and rehabilitate A-Train's arc. The move looked responsible, but it functioned as a brand patch. Homelander's involvement shifted the frame again, from harm reduction to discipline theater. The apology was staged for optics, not for change, and it detonated as predicted. Inside the office, fear-based control produced a classic information failure. Managers began hiding problems, massaging numbers, and congratulating the boss. Ashley started pulling out her own hair to survive the pressure, then curated reports that would not trigger rage. That detail tells us something important about tyranny at work. The price of bad news rises, so the supply drops. Accuracy dies first, then safety. This is how crises that could be managed early become catastrophes that cannot be managed at all. The Soldier Boy twist introduced the one external force that felt like a true constraint. His blast could strip powers, turning gods back into people. As a risk factor, it changed the math. Suddenly, there was a technology, or at least a weaponized body, that could puncture the rating's shield. Homelander understood the implication faster than the company did. Counterpower means bargaining shifts. The person who controls the new lever is the person who writes the next terms. Yet even that check bent toward narrative. Instead of rethinking the operating model, the organization tried to fold the threat into the content calendar. Could it be used to create a redemption arc, a fatal rival, a comeback? Those questions were natural to a firm built on story. They were also the wrong questions for risk. By the time Starlight's camp publicized depowerings and Homelander smiled through them, Vought was already reacting inside his frame. Family closed the circle. If Stilwell had practiced maternal management, Homelander now produced a father script of his own, through Ryan. He recast dependence as lineage and control as care. This helps explain why he leaned so hard into public displays with the boy. A family image looks like stability, but it also functions as armor. Criticize him, and you are against family. Criticize the boy, and you are monstrous. The company, addicted to wholesome optics, had no vocabulary left to oppose that move. The live test arrived when a protester challenged him in front of Ryan. He responded with lethal force. For a long second, the crowd stalled between shock and worship. Then the cheer rolled forward. That cheer did more than endorse one act. It rewrote the leash. It said the base would accept violence as authenticity if it was delivered with conviction and framed as protection. After that, performance reviews were artifacts. The only feedback that mattered came from the square. At the team level, that moment tightened the fear regime. Starlight's attempts to document abuse were recast as treason. Maeve's quiet resistance was treated as a kidnapping problem, not a personnel issue. A-Train's quest for relevance careened between self-preservation and penitence, because he knew the rules had changed. You either gave the leader a win on air, or you were next. This is what institutional capture looks like in practice. The rulebook remains on the table, but everyone is pretending not to see it. Some viewers ask why the company did not simply fire him. The answer lives in the business model. You cannot fire the person who is your market. If you try, you lose the segments he carries with him, the politicians he can activate, and the investors who believe those segments and those politicians guard their returns. In other words, the platform had become a man, and the man had become the terms of service. This is where the real-world corporate lessons fold back into the fiction. Analysts sometimes argue that shareholder democracy and consumer choice will discipline firms that go too far. But the Homelander case shows a different dynamic. When a product draws a devoted base, backlash can be monetized as easily as virtue can. The same energy that might have moved markets against Vought was being harnessed by Vought to defend the indefensible. The market responded. It did not correct. Inside the walls, the effect was numbing. Junior staff learned to inflate wins, to bake numbers that supported whatever tone the leader had set that day. Editors cut footage to erase anything that would spook him, then framed the remaining material as triumph. Legal teams wrote denials because that was safer than arguing for restraint. 8. This is not just corruption, it is a systems failure. The organism had rewired itself to protect the impervious skin at its center. When Homelander strode into meetings, he spoke like a director, not a talent. He approved scripts, cast rivals as villains, and handed out threats like notes. Managers nodded because the cost of a headshake felt existential. The important point is not just that he scared them. It is that he made them complicit in his authorship of the brand. Once they started building him the stage he wanted, they needed him to stand on it forever, because dismantling it would expose their part in the architecture. This is why every control reversed its polarity. Compliance became complicity. Crisis response became attention capture. Legal risk became a budget line. Even altruism got folded into spectacle. The company used charity segments and community events the way real corporations sometimes do, as a means to attach warm feelings to cold operations. Only here, the warmth insulated the heat at the core. A smiling child at a ribbon cutting does not change how a leader behaves in private. At the edge of the frame, the soldier boy Risk kept humming. Every time he leveled a city block, the possibility of a depowering climax returned. That possibility did not restore prudence inside Vought. It did the opposite. It drove the company to bank even harder on Homelander's base, because that base was now their only hedge. The logic felt airtight in a meeting. The stronger the attachment, the safer the asset. On the street, it read as permission. By now, investigations were open insurrections. When Starlight confronted a train with supersonic trusted you, and you got him killed, it was not a personal feud alone. It was a diagnosis. Fear had turned colleagues into informants and partners into pawns. The network effect of silence kept the system stable. Every person who knew too much had a reason to say too little. Every person who tried to say more paid a price that taught the building how to behave tomorrow. If we zoom out, the mechanism is simple. An organization optimized to tell stories will, under pressure, escalate story. It will not stop the show to retrain a star who confuses adoration with consent. It will write him a bigger scene, and hope the applause rises enough to drown out the alarms. That is not because people are evil or foolish. It is because incentives are precise, and cultures follow incentives. Even the idea of outside accountability warped under this pressure. Politicians who might have checked the firm became fans of the audience it controlled. Regulators weighed not only the law but the backlash. The premise of a neutral referee gave way to the reality of an angry crowd. Corporate power in our world has followed a similar arc, leaning on global reach and brand story to shape the conditions under which it is judged. Vought did the same, with a living mascot who enforced the narrative. The last link in the chain was the self-branding loop. Homelander learned to test the line by saying the subtext plainly. When the blowback did not materialize, he concluded the leash was imaginary. That conclusion dissolved whatever remained of PR's authority. You cannot manage someone who believes that friction is proof of authenticity, and that failure to please critics is a badge of honor. In that mind, critics are reference points to aim past, not hurdles to clear. So the system moved into its failure mode. Information darkened. Candor died. Risk grew teeth. The firm could still budget, still meet, still launch, but it could no longer correct. The boss was the brand, and the brand was the boss. The people who understood the technical dangers, from counterpowers to compromised teammates, could not move the levers that mattered. They could warn, leak, or flee. They could not govern. At this stage, a viewer's question tightens. What could possibly reintroduce limits? The story has offered two candidates. One is a hard external check, like the depowering blast. The other is an internal audience that stops cheering. Both are simple to name and difficult to realize. A hard check tilts toward violence or coup. A soft check requires millions of people to refuse the show they were taught to need. This is where we leave this stretch of the system. An asset now steering the organization that built him. A company mistaking ratings for consent. And a public being trained to treat dominance as a civic virtue. For now, the feedback loops hold. They spin in circles that tighten, grow louder, and become more dangerous. The next decisions will not look like policy debates. They will look like stage direction in a room where no one remembers who wrote the first script. The return of Soldier Boy looked, at first, like a ghost from an older brand era. He was the Cold War poster made flesh again, the prototype Vought had shelved when shinier heroes could do safer things on daytime television. What mattered, though, was not nostalgia. It was the lab file lodged under that myth. Soldier Boy wasn't just a relic. He was the original blueprint that Vought had quietly used to make their next flagship. That detail reveals a design choice disguised as fate. When Homelander learns Soldier Boy is his genetic father, the corporate origin story snaps. For years, his public tale leaned on self-making and patriotic destiny, like the country simply unboxed him. In practice, he was an engineered derivative of Soldier Boy's line, a replacement grown while the old model was still technically on the books. The important point is not lineage pride. It is how lineage rearranges loyalty. Once blood outranks brand, the company's soft levers lose weight. That paternity twist also exposes the logic inside Vought's labs. The firm never trusted the market to stay loyal to one hero, so it planned succession inside the genome. By pulling Soldier Boy's traits forward, they tried to solve a durability problem with inheritance. The risk was psychological, not chemical. A weapon told it was fathered by the company remains dependent on company love. A weapon told it was fathered by a legend starts searching for the legend. This helps explain why the next moves left boardrooms behind. Homelander reaches out to Soldier Boy with a pitch that sounds like a merger, not a reunion. Not a reunion. He offers what he calls a strictly transactional relationship. The framing matters. Instead of seeking belonging under Vought's umbrella, he proposes consolidating power across generations and bypassing the umbrella entirely. In other words, he tries to replace corporate stewardship with dynastic coordination. That move tells us the leash has inverted. There is no script for a father-son cartel because no one at Vought imagined they'd need one. Meanwhile, Soldier Boy is doing something Vought trained everyone to believe was impossible. His energy release doesn't just explode rooms. It zeroes the compound V inside bodies. Kimiko's astonished my powers are gone is not a dramatic beat for her alone. It is a proof of concept that the company's entire asset class can be turned off by a single antagonist carrying the right payload. That changes risk in a very specific way. It converts many independent risks into one correlated failure. Why that distinction matters is portfolio math. Before Soldier Boy, each soup had idiosyncratic risk. Scandal here, injury there, the occasional brand misfire. Shareholders could believe losses would be isolated. A depowering blast rewrites that. One hostile actor can erase billions in soup equity in a night. Because performance isn't merely reputational now. It is biological. The moat around Vought's products was always the idea that powers were permanent. Once permanence is questioned, insurance, contracts, and government procurement all repriced overnight. We see the scramble in how public relations starts lying faster than it can breathe. A Vought News Network anchor calls it a nation betrayed, and panics about a missing queen, while Ashley Barrett insists on air that Maeve is in rehab. The cover story is revealing. Rehab is code for controllable crisis. It keeps capability intact by implication. But Maeve's later loss of powers shows the real hazard they're hiding. What mattered here was the absence of a credible script for mass capability failure. Inside the company, Ashley tries the only playbook she knows. Cure it and contain. We hear her take a deep breath and brag they curated a coming-out story that America loves. That's content management, not safety management. It worked when the worst outcome was a cancelled endorsement. It fails when a city learns a hero couldn't fly a burning bus because a blast stripped their gifts. The important point is the mismatch. Public relations is trying to manage a liquidity crisis in superpowers with mood music. Operationally, missed rescues and inconsistent performance translate into legal exposure. Contracts assume force majeure in wars, not in ad hoc bursts from a former employee. Municipalities will renegotiate. Insurers will ask for depowering exclusions. The Pentagon will question sole source procurements if a single threat can invalidate their airborne assets. In practice, this is how a technical vulnerability becomes a regulatory pivot. The company suddenly answers to new committees and new clauses, which narrows the room for spin and inflates the price of silence. Soldier Boy's hunt for his old teammates adds a second layer. It is not strategic, it is vindictive, and that randomness magnifies fear. We hear the question on the ground. Why would he kill Crimson Countess? Wasn't she on his side? The answer ties back to Black Noir's betrayal and a lifetime of managed lies. For Vought, this means the battlefield is now being shaped by ancient internal politics they never disclosed. That detail tells us secrecy can metastasize into today's operational chaos. On the other side, you see the arms race kick in. Temporary Compound V, Temp V, slides from a lab shelf into human veins. Butcher and Hughie use it because no other tool keeps pace with Homelander or Soldier Boy. The warning is blunt. It turns your brain into Swiss cheese. That metaphor, crude as it is, helps explain the trade-off. Short-term leverage arrives by mortgaging long-term capacity. When both sides accept brain damage as cost of entry, you have exited the world of control and entered the world of attrition. This arms race exposes Vought's own contradictions. The company manufactured Temp V as a controlled demo product, proof it could package power for the military without full permanent transformations. By existing, Temp V communicated a message leaders tried to deny. Powers are products that can be adjusted, throttled, or removed. Soldier Boy's blast makes that message unavoidable. The difference is agency. When the company controls the dial, it calls it innovation. When an enemy controls it, it becomes existential risk. For Homelander, the math is even starker. Applause protected him from scandal, but applause can't fly a jet or rip a door off a submarine. If a single blast can turn Queen Maeve into a civilian, then the Seven is not seven gods. It is a liability stack one pulse away from collapse. He reads that truth faster than the executives do. You can hear it in the way he stops courting corporate approval and starts seeking power consolidation. First with Soldier Boy, then with someone smaller but more certain. That someone is Ryan. Parenthood becomes a pivot and a plan. When Homelander talks about the spotlight for his son and rattles off his own movie titles, like a bedtime inventory, he isn't just bragging. He is seeding an identity he can control. The father he wanted didn't want him. The corporation that raised him cannot protect him. Replication becomes his answer to risk. In practice, that is both human and strategic. A child can be love. A child can also be succession. This shift reframes control as legacy. If Vought can replace heroes by gestating new ones, Homelander can replace Vought by shaping the next public sovereign directly. This helps explain why finding Ryan becomes as important as neutralizing Soldier Boy. Control no longer means containment for him. It means teaching instinct, calibrating loyalty, and cutting the company out of the loop. The detail to hold on to is that legacy binds tighter than any non-disclosure agreement when the parent writes the myth at home. Meanwhile, the crowd is teaching its own lesson. The same public that cheers a lethal outburst can, on another day, gawk at a hero who can no longer fly. That volatility isn't just social media mood. It is operational planning risk. Police chiefs and governors pay attention when adoration flips because their budgets depend on reliable force. This is how applause becomes a leash for the company, then a leash for the asset, and finally, a weather vane for both. Everyone is guessing wind direction, and the forecast keeps changing. Inside the Seven, the contradictions sharpen. Atrain asks for justice after his brother is hurt, and Ashley answers with a meeting arranged to show loyalty to Homelander. The subtext is clear. Team cohesion is a hostage to appeasement, when Blue Hawk's brutality becomes a talking point instead of a moral wreckage. You see the costs of replacing governance with brand protection. That culture keeps Soups in line until an external blast removes the need to pretend. Then fear loses its purchase. You can feel the boardroom math flipping. A single antagonist with a repeatable depowering event collapses correlation assumptions and floods the balance sheet with contingent liabilities. If powers can be stripped, the strategic mode is gone. Competitors can lure cities back to conventional forces. The Department of Defense will hedge bets with drones and contractors. Though, from the outside, this looks like a narrative twist. Inside a corporation, it is a stress test the company cannot pass with messaging. Only material changes will count now. The transactional offer to Soldier Boy shows how little material control Vought currently holds. There is no warranty to enforce, no recall clause to execute. Homelander is already beyond brand discipline, and Soldier Boy was never under it to begin with. That is what failure of design looks like at the system level. The company built for scale, not for fail-safe. It assumed it could route around any problem with scripts. But you cannot PR your way through physics that turns your product into a civilian. So the market recalibrates. Investors watch VNN call it betrayal. Activists track missing heroes, and insurers rewrite policies. The same executives who once touted record engagement must now answer how they will guarantee service levels when a walking zero-day exploit roams free. What follows is predictable: obfuscation, non-answers, and ongoing investigations. The fascinating part is what fills the vacuum. Not oversight, influence. Homelander leans harder into the only moat that grows when product reliability falls: direct audience allegiance and fear inside the building. That brings us back to the central promise of this chapter. Biology and blast have outpaced branding, but they have also revealed the real structure underneath. Vought's system worked as long as compounding applause could stand in for control. The paternity reveal cuts that proxy from one side, and the depowering blast cuts it from the other. In the middle stands a leader who cannot be fired, who seeks alliance like a CEO shopping for a hostile partner, and who recruits his son as the next ring of defense. The unresolved tension now threads cleanly into the next phase. If powers are depletable, and if only influence remains, then a crowd's roar becomes more dangerous than a board's memo. It means every performer in the portfolio will manage to the loudest handclaps, even when the show's stage is a city street. It also means the last pressure the company might recognize is not conscience or compliance, but cash leaving the room. The question is whether either will arrive in time to matter. There is a point where a brand stops answering to a board and starts answering to a crowd. With Homelander, that turn arrived when applause began to outrank compliance. What mattered here was not simply that people liked him, but that their approval proved he could shatter norms and still grow stronger. When he went off script on television and railed against handlers, a segment of viewers didn't punish the outburst. They rewarded it. Inside a company built on quarterly decks that looked like product, market fit for defiance. This helps explain why engagement metrics became the new command chain. Algorithms counting watch time, trending spikes, and clip circulation did not care about norms. They measured heat. If something outraged some people but made his base watch twice as long, the dashboard lit up as success. Then came the public killing, and the test became irreversible. At a rally, when a bottle hit Ryan, Homelander lasered a man's head off in the open. The first seconds were silence, and then, crucially, cheers burst from his supporters. That detail reveals a new comeback. If the base will celebrate transgression as part of the show, then violence is no longer a crisis to manage, but a performance to monetize. In practice, applause became indemnity. You could see the shift in how Ashley ran public relations. Her job tilted from, what should he do, to what would he do, and how do we frame it as inevitable, brave, or entertaining? That pivot replaced stewardship with prediction, which favors spectacle every time. The political layer added a protective varnish. After controversial moves, Ashley's phone buzzed with establishment congratulations and invitations. "Congrats from Lindsey Graham," she said at one point, a line that landed like a memo from the old order, admitting who really had leverage now. Politics served as a shield because officials read the same dashboards and wanted the same audience. If Homelander could bring ratings, he could bring voters, donors, and attention. That flips the relation. Institutions started needing his crowd more than he needed their counsel. The company told itself that markets would correct excess if fans drifted and sponsors balked. That is a common faith in corporate circles. Let shareholders and consumers act as the accountable public. But when the most engaged consumers were the ones demanding escalation, the market amplified the very behavior it was supposed to discipline. There is an old argument that shareholders can function as a proxy for the public good if they are informed and active. In theory, that aligns capital with civil, safe outcomes. In practice here, the information stream was built by platforms tuned for outrage. So informed meant saturated with clips that rewarded hardness, not restraint. Starlight's live stream once tried to root around PR and speak to citizens directly. It exposed secrets and abuses that should have triggered a collective break. Instead, for Homelander's core fans, the confrontation became another identity test, and doubling down signaled loyalty. This is the logic of feedback capture. Outrage drives reach hardens in-group identity, and identity reframes evidence as attack. By the time a leader learns that equation, fact checks and disclosures no longer function as correction. They function as fuel. Inside the Seven, survival required studying the same math. The Deep treated obedience as strategy because he knew the real boss was the camera and the crowd behind it. A Train, trapped by his own brand arc, learned that complicity paid better than principle in a room where truth sounded like treason. That erosion of truth-telling is not just an ethical slide, it is a systems failure. When every briefing is calibrated to avoid a blow-up rather than surface a risk, the organization loses the ability to sense danger. The important point is that information itself becomes politicized as an object of personal safety. Homelander read all of this as confirmation that he was the system. The board could adjust a release date, but the audience adjusted his range. So when he looked for the next project to extend his reign, he chose something beyond contracts. Ryan. He approached fatherhood like a brand architect who had finally seized his own research lab. Instead of walls and electrodes, he used praise, access, and the intoxicating feeling of being seen. That is still control. It just wears a warmer coat. What mattered was the message wrapped in that affection. Power is who you are. Applause tells you if you're right. Anyone who tries to limit that applause is not protecting you. They are stealing you. This is parenting as product strategy. It is also a hedge against external checks, because aligning Ryan's identity to his father's image neutralizes future rivals who might appeal to the boy's conscience. In other words, Ryan is not only a son, he is the next generation of audience and asset fused. Meanwhile, corporate governance drifted toward ceremony. Legal still stamped forms, compliance still wrote memos, and the streaming service still cut sizzle reels. But the real decisions followed the gradient of attention, not the flowchart of authority. When applause pays the bills, The person who controls applause sets the rule. That is why the CEO's leverage narrowed to scheduling and damage control, while Homelander's leverage expanded to tone and pacing. The company tended the brand while the asset wrote the story. This was not an accident of personality alone. For years, businesses have argued that the market can regulate better than the state. They lobbied, courted power, and shaped public opinion to keep regulators at bay, confident that consumer choice would correct harm. Here, that confidence collapsed under its own incentives. A platform economy prices attention, not ethics. If the energetic minority loves the act that scares the majority into doom scrolling, the analytics crown the transgressor. Consider the ratings as vote logic that Vought internalized. After his norm-breaking rants, Homelander's approval in key segments went up, and that became the metric that mattered. It told executives he could be the showrunner of reality and still hold the audience. Once that lesson sticks, every internal debate bends the same way. Is a safer choice wiser? Only if the dashboard says so. If the risky move boosts time on platform, the risky move becomes sound governance. That spiral explains Ashley's capture better than any character flaw. She began optimizing for proximity to the person holding the crowd, because proximity looked like job security. And when your job is prediction, you start preferring acts you can market quickly over choices you can defend slowly. A political compliment after a scandal, like the one that made her smirk with a mix of fear and pride, taught a clear lesson. Power brokers were not disciplining Homelander. They were courting him. They were counting on the same crowd to legitimize them. At street level, the public adapted in visible ways. Fans learned to read the lights and camera as cues for alignment. Ping. A neighbor named Todd treated a soup's politics like a team jersey, and the rally cheer taught him that violent spectacle could feel like belonging. This is how risk normalizes. The longer the system runs without a correction, the more citizens start treating fear as a background cost of entertainment. You change how you walk, what you say, and where you look, and call it common sense. For markets and politics, normalization looks like stability. Contracts renew, polls settle into patterns, and sponsors recalibrate creative guidelines to fit the new edge. But that surface calm hides a quiet cliff. A system governed by applause has no emergency brake. It is only as safe as the next moment is flattering. One bad day, one humiliation on camera, and the loop can spin into something no memo, donor call, or friendly anchor can steer. The presence of Soldier Boy's depowering blast turned that cliff into a deeper drop. If a single burst can erase powers, then every confrontation is potentially decisive, and the crowd becomes even more strategic as a shield. That risk did not sober the dynamic. It intensified the need to keep the base thrilled. In practice, that pushes leaders toward what behavioral economists call loss chasing. If applause is slipping, you do something bigger to win it back. The danger is that bigger acts carry larger tail risks, and there is no institution left willing to say no. All along, two ideas had traded places. Early on, Vought believed control looked like non-disclosure agreements, handlers, and scripted segments. By this stage, the only reliable lever was the audience's willingness to cheer after the worst thing he might do. That is why people inside the machine stopped speaking cleanly. Truth became a hazard, candor a career risk, and silence a way to survive the week. Team members learned to calibrate themselves to the leader's ego, rather than the mission's safety. The important point is that this wasn't cowardice alone. It was a rational response to incentives that paid for heat, not honesty. If telling the truth costs you your platform, you find a truer north in trend lanes. So the endgame begins to look inverted. The corporation that authored the asset is now a vendor to his audience. The politician who used to offer cover now hopes to borrow some. From the outside, this can seem like a morality play about one man's corruption. But the mechanics tell a colder story about design. Build a revenue engine that rewards outrage, attach it to a person with no peer, and you have created a state where applause functions as governance. That detail points us back to the unresolved threads. Could an organized external check, like a scalable depowering technology, force a new equilibrium? Could an audience recoil reshape incentives fast enough to matter? Ryan sits at the center of both questions. If he becomes a second sun in the same orbit, applause governance might lock in for a generation. If his values diverge under pressure, he could be the first internal break in years. Either way, the lesson is already visible. Systems that confuse popularity with permission find themselves led by the thing they thought they were managing. And once applause becomes the leash, it can snap in an instant, with nothing underneath but the fall. Which is where we go next. How a structure built to sell safety tries to survive the moment safety leaves the business model. We end not with a twist, but with a set of working lessons. The point was never only that Homelander is dangerous. What mattered was how a company designed a system that made his danger predictable, then mistook applause for control. The failure was technical, emotional, and institutional at the same time. Start with attachment as a control surface. Vought tried to swap caregiving for cameras, believing surveillance could stand in for a relationship. That choice solved a short-term problem, containment, while creating a long-term one, defiance as identity. In practice, humiliation bred a loyalty to self alone, which meant any leash felt like an insult to cut. This helps explain why every attempt to manage him with shame backfired. Shame signals a boundary when love cushions it, but weaponized shame only teaches counterattack. The lab routines trained him to read scrutiny as danger, not guidance. That detail reveals why private correction so often became public revenge. Next, the metric problem. Brand ratings and engagement were treated as compliance when they were only audience temperature. Analytics hid risk until they magnified it, because the same feeds that reported escalation also rewarded it. In other words, applause became indemnity. When a bystander's killer smile received cheers, the signal was not ambiguity, it was authorization. The dashboard said, "The base is energized," and managers mistook energy for safety. This worked because the company had collapsed moral thresholds into market thresholds. The measurement system had no place to register harm unless harm hurt ratings. Then came single asset capture. Organizing everything around one star felt efficient and on brand. But it inverted who served whom. Meetings, security, even legal risk were staged to flatter the asset's story, so corporate tools drifted into props. The star became the organization, and that is when policy quietly turned into stage direction. You can hear it when executives start explaining their plans in the language of scenes rather than controls. They talked arcs and reveals, while the risk profile grew teeth. In practice, once your best employee is also your largest liability, internal honesty corrodes. People begin editing truth to match the room where it is safest to speak. Soldier Boy's return exposed the portfolio blindness behind all that. One blast could erase powers across multiple top earners, revealing how correlated the risk had become. Vought had optimized for hero narratives, not resilience architecture. No distributed backups, no safe modes, and few assets who were valuable without spectacle. That is why the temp v arms race landed like gasoline. Short-term parity felt like insurance, but it multiplied volatility and created new medical and legal liabilities. The important point is not just that powers could vanish, but that the company had no doctrine for operating after they did. Systems without graceful failure collapse loudly. Look at leverage inversion. For years, secrets, non-disclosure agreements, and fear bound people to the company line. But when the asset owns the biggest secrets, and the public fear points outward, those levers flip. Suddenly, exposure hurts the firm more than the star, and threat modeling turns into crisis choreography. Political tailwinds worsened this inversion. Patrons needed the same audience that the star could summon at will, So restraint sounded like bad politics. Oversight became flattery dressed as alignment. The pattern tracks with critiques of corporate governance. Tinkering at the board level can tighten investor accountability without delivering public accountability. Even shareholder optimism has limits here. Robert Monks argues markets can discipline abuse if owners have the right information and incentives. But in this case, the most salient information was performative, and the incentive structure prized virality over prudence. When owners and audience blur, spectacle colonizes stewardship. There is a deeper media lesson too. Culture industries often consolidate around safe brands, then use those brands as engines for new work. As critics note, labor layered on old intellectual property can become alienated from its original purpose. Man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, as the line goes, and the brand begins to manage the maker. Vought pursued that logic with a living brand. The more it centered operations on the icon, the more the icon dictated operations. What looked like control through continuity was actually dependency through familiarity. That dependency left no appetite for decisions that might dent the image, even when the system required dents to learn. Consider narrative control versus operational control. In comics, a publisher can declare a single continuity to retire confusion, as Marvel did after complex multiverse arcs. In theory, one timeline reduces chaos. In practice, reality does not obey canon. Soldier Boy's revelation, Temp Foy, and Ryan's emergence all reopened branches that a press release could not seal. That gap matters. It shows why branding cannot replace governance. The story can align incentives around a feeling, but it cannot adjudicate conflict or absorb shock. When the story is also the product, any corrective mechanism sounds like heresy. Unnecessary friction is misread as disloyalty. So what would a better architecture have looked like? Start with distributed authority that does not root through one office or one ego. Spread custodianship of critical decisions across independent units that are insulated from rating cycles. This helps prevent a single star from capturing the only room where no can be spoken. Add true mentorship, not handler management. Pair young soups with credible elders who earn trust outside of publicity and who are empowered to pause missions for development needs. Mentorship functions as both a pressure release and a mirror, which is exactly what surveillance cannot provide. A mentor can validate identity while shaping judgment. Build independent audit power with teeth. That means a unit that reports outside the commercial chain, with authority to ground assets, freeze budgets, and disclose violations through protected channels. Whistleblower protections and stakeholder representation, workers, communities, even victims' advocates, should have seats at the oversight table. These are classic governance moves that aim accountability beyond investors. Engineer safe failure modes. Require layered stand-down protocols that do not depend on an individual's mood. Explore non-lethal counters and depowering remission as supervised medical interventions, governed by multi-party consent and review. The goal is not humiliation, but reversible control that lowers stakes before they become existential. Rewire incentives away from spectacle. Compensation should reward truth-telling, de-escalation, and verified service outcomes, not only reach and merch sales. Publish duty of care metrics alongside ratings. This helps align the company with society's interest, which corporate reformers argue is where accountability often fails when boards focus only on investors. Now back to Ryan, because replication without reform is the fastest way to rerun a crisis. Swapping cameras for praise seems humane, but it still treats love as a management technique. Conditional affection is just a softer cage. It collapses whenever the child's autonomy collides with the brand's needs. That is how a legacy project becomes a sequel to the original mistake. If Ryan is a hinge, mentorship and independent community contact are the grease. He needs adults whose authority does not originate from his father or his father's employer. This gives him reference points that do not disappear when applause does. It also teaches him that correction can be care, not attack. Remember the hostage management rule. If your stability relies on never angering your most powerful node, you do not have a system. You have a ritual for buying time. That ritual gets more expensive, more cruel, and less effective the longer it runs. Leverage inversion will keep pushing outcomes toward escalation. Homelander's ownership of secrets, his lineage, the company's past crimes, the gaps in oversight, means exposure, strengthens his narrative while weakening the firm. Each public humiliation he survives becomes precedent. Each unchecked boundary becomes an invitation to redraw the map. The political sphere will not self-correct while it chases the same audience dynamics. Constituency statutes and board tweaks can help at the margin, but they do not rewire incentives where virality rules. Markets can respond when given the right information, yet the informational environment here is engineered for heat. In that heat, prudent signals cool too quickly to matter. Which brings us to the late payoff we have been circling. Once applause replaces oversight, you cannot steer by ratings without driving into risk. Applause rewards novelty, and in this domain, novelty usually means escalation. The leash becomes a cheer line, and the crowd becomes the indemnifier. What mattered most is that Vought taught its strongest asset what rules were for. Control was something you do to other people, not something you accept yourself. That was the curriculum baked into every press tour, every defensive lie, and every choreographed redemption arc. The student learned. These lessons scale beyond one character and one show. Any institution that confuses brand compliance with real control is volunteering for the same inversion. The fix is not heroic leadership, but humble architecture, durable attachments, distributed authority, independent audits, safe failures, and incentives that value truth over spectacle. The hard part is psychological as much as structural. It requires executives to accept visible limits in exchange for real safety, and audiences to trade a little heat for a lot of civilization. It also requires designers of powerful systems, biological, digital, or political, to plan for the day their creation stops answering the phone. That day is not failure. It is the first honest test. So the final insight is clear. Vought did not just lose control of Homelander. It taught him that control is for other people, then built a marketplace that cheered him for proving it. A product built to embody a story will eventually demand to write it.